With the start of the massive counteroffensive of the Ukrainian army, the Russian army began to lose one by one the lands it controlled. It looks like the Ukrainian forces will soon take control of Bakhmut while liberating an area of 200 kilometers from Russian control on the Eastern Front from the first 2 days of the counteroffensive. Despite all the denials of Russian President Vladimir Putin, the Ukrainian counterattack hurt the Russian army in the first 2 days. As the Russian troops retreated into the Donetsk region, news of the desertion of many troops began to follow. But the attacks of the Ukrainian army were not limited to the Eastern Front. Ukraine has turned its offensive operations towards Crimea and the surrounding areas of the peninsula. In recent days, the Ukrainian forces have been disrupting the order of the Russian army by launching long-range missiles and UAV attacks on the Crimea, Zaporizhia, Mariupol, Melitopol, Berdyansk, and Donbas regions. It continues its attacks, especially in the attrition attacks on the Zaporizhia region and in the attempt to cut off the supply routes of the Russian army to the north of Crimea. Because of these attacks, the officials appointed by the Kremlin in Crimea began to evacuate North Crimea regardless of Russian and Ukrainian. Here in this video for you, we will cover the sudden evacuation of the Russian army in Crimea and the latest updates on the ingenious attacks of Ukraine to wear out the Russian army. Don't forget to subscribe and like our channel. So let's get started. The Russians are preparing to flee from the north of Crimea to the interior and into Russia. They are taking measures to prepare for the displacement of local Ukrainians, the theft of material and cultural values, according to the National Center for the Resistance of Ukraine. The Russians ordered the Russian administrations in the north of the temporarily occupied peninsula to prepare for evacuation. According to the Center for the National Resistance, they were instructed to maintain lists for the forced evacuation of the population into the depths of the peninsula or to the territory of the Russian Federation. In particular, according to information received from the Crimean underground resistance movement, relevant preparations have already been made in the city of Armyansk. The National Resistance Center stated that the representatives of the Russian administrations and their families, as well as equipment and documents, will be evacuated first. At the same time, the Russians began to create lists of materials and cultural assets that they plan to steal and take to Russia. The expected massive counteroffensive of the Ukrainian army began despite the absence of any official notification. Although the first target of the Ukrainian army was the Eastern Front, attacks also began on Kherson and Zaporizhia. Prior to this, many drone attacks had also taken place with the aim of weakening the Russian elements in Crimea. For example, recently, Russian targets in Crimea suffered a night of nightmares by Ukrainian drones. According to Ukrainian military officials, a total of 7 Mugan 5 drones have been deployed to various facilities in different regions of Ukraine. The purpose of the drone swarm attack by the Ukrainian armed forces may be to disable the Russian logistics network in the north of Crimea, disrupting the logistics with the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. In this context, it is of great advantage that the Ukrainian army, with the support of the West, cannot detect Russian targets over Crimea from satellite. A Ukrainian drone crashed into a warehouse in the Komsomolskoye settlement near Simferopol, Kunstau. Moscow is located on the main highway between Simferopol and Zonkoye, also in the south of the peninsula. A drone was destroyed near the village of Zavetnoye, southwest of Simferopol. It is assumed that its target may be a water pumping station. The target of the other 2 drones was the naval base of Russia's Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. The Russian military claimed to have shot down 2 drones near Sevastopol, also in the northern part of the peninsula near the Russian airport of Giankue. Ukrainian drones attacked. Also, the Russian army claims to have destroyed 2 Ukrainian drones near the Mahmud train station north of Giankue. In addition, an airstrike was carried out on the Russian railway line and military depots in Myslova, near the Giankue-Kherson highway. In the past weeks, the Ukrainian army has attacked Russian elements stationed in Crimea. Almost every night during these attacks, the port of Sevastopol was also the target of Ukrainian UAVs, raiding with 10 UAVs towards Sevastopol, where Russian S-400 systems are concentrated. The Ukrainian army targeted 2 Russian ammunition depots, a port watchtower, and 2 air defense systems. The massive drone strike on Crimea certainly seems to have caused concern in the Russian military, especially given the regular drone strikes from Ukraine. In particular, the failure of the S-400s to work on time again led to questioning the reliability of these air defense systems. Another major attack on Crimea took place in the past weeks. A railway line was blown up in the Simferopol district of Crimea, causing a large number of cars to derail and train traffic to be suspended. An explosion occurred on the railway last morning in the Simferopol district of Crimea. As a result, 5 cars of a train loaded with grain overturned. The movement of electric trains on the Simferopol-Svistopol line has been suspended. It is stated that the incident took place near the village of Tinstink. About 50 meters of railway tracks were damaged. A large crater formed where the explosion took place. At that moment, a total of 8 against Israel, with 5 of the train passing through the railway track. Last March, an explosion at a substation in the village of Fedorivka, Melitopol district, Zaporozhye region, cut off electricity to a main train station where the Russian army was carrying heavy weapons to the front. Previously, Caliber missile systems transported by rail in Crimea were destroyed after the explosion in Jankoy. Although it is not known by which unit of the Ukrainian army these explosions took place, it is obvious that the purpose of the explosions was to block the logistic lines of the Russian army. Russia has lost its logistic capabilities in the east and north directions, and the Russian army's arms and ammunition needs are supplied through Crimea. The fact that Russia's only remaining logistics line is also being cut undoubtedly supports the Ukrainian counteroffensive and the Ukrainian liberation of Crimea. As a result of this counteroffensive, a series of supports are also coming from Ukraine's Western partners for the liberation of Crimea. Ukraine has stepped up calls for the U.S. to provide ATACMS to retake Crimea, launched from the U.S. already supplied HIMARS. These missiles have a range of about 200 miles, allowing Ukraine to strike positions in Crimea with relative confidence from behind their lines. In addition, ATACMS will enable the Ukrainian army to advance towards Melitopol and cut off Russia's land bridge to Crimea. If the Ukrainians were able to do this, Russia would have to rely on air and ground defenses to supply troops in the Kerch Strait Bridge or Crimea, which Ukraine has already proven capable of attacking. This could lead to a kind of modern siege and allow Ukraine to potentially retake Crimea as the Ukraine war enters its second year. Analysts are watching closely whether Ukraine can maintain the momentum it has gained since the end of 2022. If they succeed, it is not unlikely that they will finally be able to retake Crimea 10 years later. Also, the successful progress of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the first 2 days is an indication of how close Ukraine is to the idea of liberating Crimea. But while the current weapons of the Ukrainian army are sufficient for the eastern and southern fronts, it is not enough for the Russian elements that have been in Crimea since 2014. That's why Ukraine's Western partners, especially the US, should give the necessary support. The war between Ukraine and Russia has turned into a full-blown intelligence struggle, especially recently. Now, both sides of the war are after collecting critical data for the next move. In this regard, important war analysts see Russia in a much more advantageous position because, as you know, Russian leader Vladimir Putin was a former KGB agent. For this reason, it was expected that Putin would prepare his war plans according to his old habits and intelligence criteria. But things didn't go as planned for Putin. Since the start of the large-scale invasion of Ukraine, about 400 Russian diplomats have been expelled from European countries on charges of spying. As you can see, the Russian intelligence was seriously unsuccessful in this regard. The last example of Russian failure in the field of espionage took place in Poland as Poland successfully caught Russian spies. Its war to build Europe's strongest army against Putin's harsh threats. Poland captured a dozen Russian agents and deployed a massive army as a precautionary measure to the borders of Russia and Belarus. As Oracle Eyes, we have thoroughly investigated this desperate situation of Russia against Poland for you. As a result of our research, we have reached very striking special information. Polish authorities arrested 3 more Russian agents on suspicion of being part of a gang of Russian spies planning to sabotage a shipment of aid to Ukraine, bringing the number of arrests to 12. The 3 new Russian suspects are believed to be gathering intelligence on routes to deliver military aid to Ukraine. Polish media outlet RMF-FM reported. One of the most important details in this regard was that these 3 Russian agents captured by Poland were the key men of the leader, Vladimir Putin. This claim has almost moved the world agenda. According to the Polish authorities, The 3 Russian suspects arrested were detained during the preparations for the demolition actions. I wonder if these 3 Russian suspects were in contact with the Russian authorities while they were preparing their action plans just before they were caught. For this reason, documents and other evidence to be obtained from Russian agents during the arrest are of great importance. In other news, prosecutors in the eastern Polish city of Lublin accused the 3 Russian defendants of being part of an organized crime syndicate, as well as working for foreign intelligence and against Poland. Already, Polish Interior Minister Mariusz Kaminski had announced that the Internal Security Agency had arrested 9 people suspected of collaborating with Russian secret services. Now, with the arrest of 3 Russian suspects, judicial proceedings on this issue have gained momentum. The Polish judiciary ordered the arrest of the 3 Russian agents and also extended the detention of 9 Russian suspects. Speaking to reporters at the time of the arrest of Russian agents, the Polish Interior Minister stated that the suspects were conducting intelligence activities against Poland and were preparing sabotage actions at the request of the Russian intelligence. Kaminski added that the Russian suspects were foreigners from countries in eastern Poland. Mariusz Kaminski reported that, according to collected evidence, the group followed rail routes to Ukraine, including collecting information on arms deliveries to Kiev. The suspects were also preparing subversive acts designed to sabotage the supply of equipment, weapons and aid to Ukraine. The Russian spy gang has placed at least 50 surveillance devices, including cameras on roads and GPS trackers on the shipments to transport weapons to Ukraine. Polish media outlet RMF-FM reported. In this regard, the Minister of Internal Affairs of Poland announced that with the help of Ukraine cameras, electronic equipment and GPS transmitters to be mounted on transport vehicles have been secured. Poland's investigation of the Russian spy gang continues apace, and Polish investigators are checking bridges and overpasses on key roads to Ukraine for surveillance equipment. On the other hand, similar checks are being carried out at the storage facilities near the railway routes least close to the Polish border. After Russia invaded Ukraine in February last year, also, Polish police officers are scanning for surveillance on the eastern section of the A4 highway, leading to Poland's border with Ukraine. RMF-FM reports Polish authorities announced that the Russian spy network had been investigated 4 months before the arrests were made in March. These statements show that Poland is a staunch ally of Ukraine and a hub for the delivery of weapons to the Ukrainian armed forces. In addition to Poland, the Russian spy network continues to be quickly dismantled in other European countries. If you remember, Sweden had decided to expel 5 Russian diplomats on charges of spying. Swedish Foreign Minister Tobias Billström stated that the Russian ambassador to Sweden, Viktor Tatarintsev, was informed of the deportations of 5 Russian diplomats. Also V-Square, a network of independent media outlets from Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia recently found that around 200 satellite dishes on the roofs of 39 Russian diplomatic missions in Europe were used for spying, and the devices were installed above the embassy. On the other hand, Swedish, Norwegian, Finnish, and Danish media published a joint investigation into how Russia is preparing to sabotage wind turbines, gas pipes, and electrical cables located near the Scandinavian countries. In addition, Russia was carrying on spying and intelligence activities not only on land but also in the seas. In recent weeks, Swedish broadcaster SVT reported that Russia is using military and civilian ships to spy in Swedish waters as part of an espionage program that plans to sabotage energy infrastructures in Northern Europe. Russian espionage efforts in Sweden also spread to Norway, another Scandinavian country. Norway has announced that it will expel 15 Russian diplomats working at the Russian embassy in Oslo. Norwegian Foreign Minister Anniken Huitfeldt described the deportation as an important step in countering and reducing the level of Russian intelligence activity. Norway aims to protect its national interests by deporting 15 Russian diplomats it accuses of espionage. This is why these diplomats urgently need to leave the country. The Norwegian government website reports. It was also noted that Norway would welcome diplomats from Russia but would not allow intelligence services to work under diplomatic guise. But after such situations happened, Norwegian Foreign Minister Anniken Huitfeldt announced that they would no longer issue visas to intelligence officers applying for visas to Norway. Anniken Huitfeldt did not elaborate on whether the government made the decision based on a specific event. Wiedewelt stated that the country's internal intelligence service will make the necessary statements on the subject. In addition, the Norwegian newspaper VG wrote that the number of expelled Russian diplomats was so high for the first time. The newspaper stated that about 40 people work at the Russian embassy in Oslo and the Kirkenes and Barentsburg consulates, including the deported diplomats. Retaliation for Norway's decision to expel Russian diplomats came without delay. The Russian embassy in Norway described the deportation decisions as an extremely hostile step and announced that it would retaliate against it. 15 Norwegian diplomats are expected to be expelled, according to Russia's threat of retaliation. Minister Hoot Filtre reacted to the retaliatory statements of the Russians in this regard. Wiedewelt stated that Russia had no reason to respond and that none of the Norwegian diplomats in Russia were intelligence officers. Wiedewelt also stated that his country wants to establish normal diplomatic relations with Russia, claiming that they are diplomats and stressing that they do not want Russians who are actually intelligence officers. Norway expelled 3 more Russian diplomats last year for allegedly being intelligence officers. This is how the espionage network that Russia established in Europe and even all over the world was brought to light. Thanks to the clarification of all these events, thanks to the work carried out by the countries of the world in this regard, the Russian espionage network began to collapse gradually. Other countries that oppose the Ukrainian war and are not Russian supporters have doubled their measures against the spy gangs established by the Russians around the world. After the events in Norway, Poland, and countries such as Sweden, now, all agents disguised as Russian diplomats have become a target. In short, the world is now gathered under one roof against the Russian occupation. Ukraine has made a critical move. The Silent Eagles are at work this time. A massive airstrike was launched on the biggest oil factories in Krasnodar. This indirectly dealt the strongest blow to the Russian army. The reaction of Putin after the stop of the Ukrainian army stunned the whole world. In the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Ukrainian army began to make critical and strategic moves. At the heart of these were many lies that Russia had previously had problems with. As a result of Russia's resource constraints, the Ukrainian army started to take the leading position in these last days. The last step taken by the Ukrainian army, which is aware of Russia's problems, especially in the field of oil, has stunned the whole world as a result of the steps taken by the Ukrainian army. In recent times, it has become more and more challenging against the Russian army. Behind this success, the support it receives from the West has a great impact. The mobilization of Western countries for the development of the Ukrainian army was the basis for both qualitative and quantitative progress. The Ukrainian soldiers, who were close to victory over the Russian army, began to make the best use of this progress. Foremost among these was the development of intelligence. As a result of the proper use of this intelligence, the Ukrainian army began to take the most important steps, and it located one of the most important oil factories in Krasnodar. This was the basis for progress in every field. First of all, the Ukrainian army directed its intelligence forces towards this area, stating that there were more than one factory detected near Krasnodar. Ukrainian intelligence said that a possible operation in this region would completely destroy the oil supplied to Russian vehicles and prevent operation against Ukraine, even for a short time. This immediately mobilized the Ukrainian army, and there was information about an operation against the airports near Krasnodar. After that, a few Ukrainian agents infiltrated among the staff of the oil factory in Krasnodar and stated that a large part of the oil produced in this region was for the vehicles and the war. And it was precisely at this point that the Ukrainian army, confident of the operation, decided to lead its Silent Eagles towards Kherson. The personnel at the airport in Kherson were in charge of preparing these drones when suddenly something unexpected happened and the date of the operation had to be pushed back. After receiving news that Russia would soon send a train loaded with oil to the Ukrainian region, the Ukrainian army mobilized to send its ships to that region. The Ukrainian army, which wanted to utilize its many advantages at this point, started to make the necessary sonar scans. And a very big step was taken against the Russian army. The Ukrainian army started to move, removed the unmanned aerial vehicles, and the fastest way possible. It was going to be a very comfortable operation for Ukrainian drones due to the fact that the Russian army could not deal with public order sufficiently due to the intensive work in the region and the losses it suffered in the operations in Bakhmut. It was at this point that the Ukrainian army discovered another vulnerability, and the Silent Eagles dealt the hardest blow to the Russian army. The Ukrainian army realized that there were no forces in this area that could repel the drones. The fact that the Russian army does not even have air defense systems in this region showed the whole world how much trouble Putin is facing, and the drones moved towards the region for the move. That would really embarrass Putin. The exact coordinates of the factories belonging to one of Russia's most important oil oligarchs were detected, and the Ukrainian army immediately started shelling. This hit on the oil factory created a huge noise in the neighborhood. The bombardment had very serious consequences, as the oil destined for Russian troops in Ukraine was stored in this area. This shipment, which would have ended the Russian army's resource shortages, was completely wasted. The damage caused by the drones caused the factory to completely burn down. The soldiers that the Russian army had in this region for sure went through hell, and the Ukrainian army moved away from this area before the drone sent to hijack the Ukrainian drones arrived. And it has won its most important victory against the Russian army so far. At the same time, the Ukrainian army now has the biggest advantage over the Russians, especially since it is blocking oil from Krasnodar. The fact that this issue, which will severely hamper Russian regional activities in Crimea, is being squeezed more and more as time goes on, signaled how complicated things could get, and the Ukrainian army changed all the balances in Crimea. But Putin's response to the Ukrainian army's blow to the Russians after these developments confused the whole world, and this situation stunned the whole world. In recent days, Putin has begun to change many of the speculations that have emerged since the beginning of the war, as the Ukrainian army has taken very harsh steps against the Russians. In the beginning, Putin was specifically sharing Ukraine's cross-border operations with the whole world. The most important reason for this was to take the position of a victim against Ukraine and move on. But things started to change when the Ukrainian army started to show great effort and skill in cross-border operations. Putin did not know what to do. The increase in such operations revealed that Putin was no longer able to ensure border security in Russia as he used to. If this continues, it is unclear how Putin will act against the Ukrainian army, which is becoming increasingly weakened. This gave the Ukrainian army a noticeable lead in the war, and the Ukrainian army is now in the most advantageous position against the Russians. Then the people in Russia expressed that they did not want a leader who could not even ensure border security. There were huge uprisings against Putin, and this has put Putin on the move, and Putin mobilized all the means at his disposal to make the most critical move. Putin decided that the Russian media would cover the Ukrainian offensive with great secrecy. While the Russian army's operations were exaggerated, Putin's blackout of Ukraine's operations was actually one of the signs that the war was lost. According to many experts who predicted that there was no victory for the Russian army in this area, the fact that Putin's political career depended on this war was indicative of everything. And the Russian army is now in one of its worst positions against Ukraine. This, once again, shows that the Ukrainian army has the power to end the war in a short time. The comments made by war analysts on this issue shocked the whole world. According to war analysts, it has been confirmed that the Ukrainian army will end the war in a short time as a result of the steps taken by Russia, especially in foreign policy. Putin has almost no chance left. This means that the Ukrainian army is becoming more and more active in everything day by day. There has been talk about the possibility of the Ukrainian army taking the victory in main areas if it continues in this way. And it has also become clear that Putin, who does not have the power to stand against the Ukrainian army, is now asking for support from many countries, and the Ukrainian army is now mobilized to take very big steps against the Russians. Ukraine, which has consistently used the prolongation of the war to its advantage, has begun to take more and more steps against Putin. If this continues, it is even expected that a large part of the Russian army will soon be captured. The whole world is blaming Putin for the increasing number of captured soldiers by demoralized groups. If it continues like this, Putin's political career is expected to enter a period of more and more difficulties, and he is expected to advance against Ukraine in such a way that he can hardly breathe anymore. And this reveals that the Ukrainian army is now capable of taking much bigger steps against the Russians.